aim to be as informed and knowledgeable as possible about the political landscape in Israel so that we can make informed choices. And so with that in mind, I am delighted to welcome our speakers, Shai and Ayala, who are brilliant academics, and they're also members of Molad. Molad is a Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. So Shai Agmon is a lecturer in political philosophy at University College London, and he's also the Academic Director of Molad. And he will start by telling us what Molad is. So for those of you who don't know, don't worry. So his research focuses on democratic theory, political competition, and the rise of right-wing populism in Israel. Alongside his academic work, he writes regularly for leading publications inside and outside of Israel, and he also brings extensive political and public policy experience from across the liberal camp. And we also have with us Ayala Panievsky, who is a presidential fellow in the Department of Journalism at City St. George's University of London. Ayala is also a research fellow at Molad. Her research focuses on media under attack, authoritarian populism, and democratic backsliding. Her first book, The New Censorship: How the War on the Media is Taking Us Down, will be published this September. So we'll start with a conversation between Shai and Ayala. So please, can I ask you to be on mute? But feel free to use the chat to share any thoughts that you may have and ask questions. This can be in English, or if you feel more comfortable in Hebrew, that's fine as well. We can translate. And we will have time for questions in the second half of our session, which will be managed by my colleagues from We Democracy, Gal and Galia. So I think that's it from me. Shai and Ayala, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for this kind of very warm introduction. And thank you everyone for being here, and thank you We Democracy for hosting this event. That also I also waited a long time to have this opportunity to talk to you all. As Jenny said, before we kind of dive into the conversation, I just want to say a few words about Molad, the think tank that both Ayala and I are part of. So Molad basically exists to kind of generate new ideas and political arguments, and to create a vision for Israel's liberal camp. We try to kind of grapple with, let's say, the deepest questions about Israel or about this place. So what is the best way to achieve lasting and stable security? How should Jewish identity relate to democracy and equality for all citizens? What are the viable political paths to end the conflict with the Palestinians and other Arab countries? What kind of constitutional and institutional design does Israel need? And so on and so forth. Now, to do this, we work through three departments. The academic department, which I lead, brings together around 16 fellows, one of whom is Ayala, that will be with me in this conversation today. And I hope that before long, we can reverse the roles, and I will interview her in a discussion on the Israeli media, something I think we have already agreed with Jenny that we might do in the near future. And our fellows are, in my view, brilliant thinkers from across disciplines and across the country. They write for popular magazines, appear in the media, advise for politicians, and together we try to develop relevant and persuasive liberal story for the most urgent questions Israeli society faces. Now, so we have our academic department, and then we have our training department where we work with students, young people, and pre-military mechinot to kind of help cultivate the next generation of liberal thinkers and leaders. And finally, we have public outreach department that makes sure that our research and messaging actually reach the hands of politicians, activists, and decision makers. Now, what makes Molad distinctive, at least in my view, is that we try to combine academic rigor with a clear, realistic, and hands-on approach to politics. So we are not naive, but we are ambitious. We believe in what can be done right now in Israel, if we think clearly and strategically. And some of that outlook will, I hope, kind of come through in this conversation between Ayala and myself, about the Israeli Center. Now, the guiding conviction behind all of our work, and this is the final thing I'll say about Molad, is that ideas, they matter. There's a line from The Economist that you all probably know, John Maynard Keynes, that I often quote to illustrate kind of the point about ideas. So he said, the quote goes like this: the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful, than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Now, for too long, our side of the political camp or map has neglected the war of ideas. And Molad is here basically to fight back and to make sure liberal ideas have the power to shape Israel's future. And if you're interested, you are warmly invited to join our WhatsApp group and our newsletter. I think they are now in the chat box. You have links for both. And also, if you would like to help us carry out this work forward, we are an NGO and we'll be grateful for any contribution, whatever the size. Every donation makes a real difference for us, so you can find the link in the chat for that as well. Okay, with that, let me hand things over to Ayala, who will kind of lead the conversation.
Thanks, Shai, and thanks to We Democracy, and thanks to everyone for being here. I know there is a lot of content out there competing with us, so I really appreciate that so many of you care enough about this project and mission to be part of the conversation. And I would like to open by asking Shai, why are we talking about the Israeli Center, really? Why do you think that the failure of the Israeli Center is something so important to engage with right now?
So I think so. The easy answer is kind of just to say, like Jenny opened this conversation, is that the Israeli Center has been the dominant force in Israel's liberal camp for 2 decades now, and without understanding the problem of the Israeli Center, we will not be able to understand Israeli politics at all and our way forward. But before kind of giving the fuller answer to this question, let me start, I think, the conversation by acknowledging what many people here probably thought when they first saw the title of this talk. So it might be something like, how can this lefty say the center has a problem when it is the left that has collapsed and become irrelevant for the past 2 decades? And that's a fair point. Nothing I think I'm going to say today changes that fact, and the Israeli left deserves the blame for its own collapse, and we can I think, and should analyze that story another time.
So you're
But
saying
what
your criticism of the center doesn't mean that you don't have enough criticism of the Israeli left. That's what you're saying.
Exactly, I have enough from everything. But what I think has been missing from the conversation is scrutiny of the center. And because since 2006, the center, not the left, has been the dominant actor in the liberal camp, the main opposition to Likud. And yet, despite this prominence, it has not changed Israel's political trajectory. Quite the opposite, actually. So during its dominance, the center promised moderation and stability, but what Israel got instead? The most extremist and polarized era we ever had, with the Kahanist party in government. The center promised to protect democratic institutions, and we are now in historic democratic backsliding. The center promised to represent in their words, the sane majority in the middle, and the country has continued to drift further and further and further to the right. And all of this, again, has happened not under the left's watch, but under the center's. So why is that? I think to start answering, I can kind of make, if you allow me, kind of short, maybe a bit, not that short, but a historical detour to kind of explain. So there have really been 2 different centers in the recent 2 decades in Israeli politics. So what I call in my research, the old Israeli center of Kadima, and the new center, or what I call later the hollow center of Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. And the difference between them, I think, tells us a lot about Israeli politics. So very briefly, the old center began with Kadima, well, it began with Kadima under Ariel Sharon, later led by Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni. I assume most of you know this kind of history, so I'll just glance over it. But the point of going back there is that Kadima, despite all of its flaws, and it had many, was a successful centrist experiment, at least in two important ways. So first, Kadima promised and actually managed to move voters from the soft right, what centrist parties have been promising for more than a decade. Kadima was able to move voters from the soft right into the center. And this, in turn, changed the long-standing political terrain in Israel, which for decades before that had been defined by a contest between Labor and Likud, or Ma'arach and Cherut, and etc. And this change worked. So in the 2006 election, Kadima drew heavily from Likud voters, while Labor actually held roughly the same number of seats it had before. So putting it differently, Kadima didn't cannibalize the left. It actually expanded the liberal bloc by winning voters from the right. So that's the first thing, why the Kadima was successful. Second, Kadima created real political competition, and this is crucial. It did this not by, avoiding controversy, but by setting an agenda and taking a stand. So most dramatically, through the disengagement from Gaza, a move that split the country and split the Likud party itself. Now, you might think whatever you want about the disengagement plan, that it was a disaster, or you might think it was necessary. It doesn't matter for this conversation. The point is that it was a bold ideological act that injected new competition into the system. So the left stood for, back then, bilateral peace negotiations, right? The center advanced unilateral disengagement, and the right pushed for conflict management and continued settlement expansion. So in other words, Kadima created a genuine contest of ideas in the future. And that's what real competition actually looks like. You put an alternative on the table, you win some, you lose some, but you change the political map. And you take part in setting the agenda on Israel's most important issue, which is, of course, security, borders, and peace. So the old center, for all its flaws, at least competed. It fought over the central question of Israeli politics, as I said, border security and peace, the occupation, etc. Now, the new center, by contrast, which emerged with Yesh Atid and later on with Benny Gantz, here with the new center, the story changed completely. So instead of competing on the central dividing issue in Israeli politics, again, security and borders, the new center, instead of saying, here's our vision for peace, here's our vision for security, here's our vision for the disengagement, or whatever you want, it said, we will manage the country responsibly. We will avoid the extremes. We will heal divisions. So the new center defined itself not by putting forward a vision, but by avoiding one. In the best case, and this is the case of Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid, and I can talk more about it in the Q&A if you want, about specific parties. But in the best case, it stayed silent on the conflict. In the worst case, it fully adopted the right-wing's assumptions, in Benny Gantz's case, for instance. So Lapid called his politics new politics, but his new politics turned to be depoliticization. So not taking a stance at all about the main issue that divides Israeli politics. And the results of the rise of the new center, and this is where I end this kind of detour, the results, I think, were and still are quite striking. So if you think about it, the new center never managed to bring in soft right voters. So unlike Kadima, it did not shift blocks at all. That's the first thing. The second thing is that its growth, the center's growth, the new center's growth, came entirely at the expense of the left. So Labor and Meretz shrank, while Lapid and Gantz grew, but the overall size of the liberal camp did not expand, it actually shrunk. Because if you think about it, the centers, the new centers, in contrast to Kadima, the new centers' only real taste of power, the government they were able to establish, came under very, very special circumstances when it was able to form a coalition with staunch right-wingers, which were just at the moment anti-Netanyahu. So that was more about Netanyahu than about ideology, and it was never sustainable. And if you think about the Knesset of the Shinui, the change government of Naftali Bennett, it was almost the most right-wing Knesset in Israel's history. So just to kind of recap, if Kadima's success was measured by moving soft right voters and creating political competition, the new center failed at both. And this is the bottom line. While the old center managed to move votes and create competition, the new center hollowed politics out. It took the central conflicts of Israeli life, border, security, peace, and pushed them just off the table. And by doing so, and this is for me as kind of also a researcher of competition, this is why it's so important, it eliminated competition where it mattered most. And without competition, the right has marched forward pretty much unchallenged. So despite its relative success in terms of seats in the Knesset, for instance, the Israeli center has failed where it matters in politics, not just getting seats, but setting the agenda and exercising what I call, real power. So think about it. Small right-wing parties with 4 seats in the Israeli center have done more, in my view, to shape Israel's direction over the past 2 decades than the center has, despite winning 30 or more seats in almost every election. And that, to me, I think is the essence of the center's failure, if you kind of want to talk about that.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying not all center politics is necessarily futile, and we had a different kind of centrist politics in Israel in the past. We had a party that was formed by a staunch right-wing hawk and war criminal in Arik Sharon, but who came to the center and actually offered some kind of vision for the future of Israel. In his case, it was the disengagement from Gaza. But what we are seeing nowadays is a different kind of centrist politics and centrist parties that are actually, if I understand you correctly, they don't even meet their own tests. So even by their own measures, because what was the promise of the center in Israel? Why has it become so popular? Why are Yair Lapid and then Benny Gantz and all these figures who mainly their main characteristics in Israeli politics is perhaps that they are not labeled as lefties. That was the initial promise. And they were saying, vote for us, we will bring voters from the right to the center, and we will build this kind of liberal coalition, and we will march forward in a better direction. But what you're saying is actually what they did. They couldn't bring the voters from the right. They keep shifting further and further to the right, trying to signal and attract these imagined right-wing voters who are not coming. And it's been a while. I mean, these parties have been around long enough so that we know this is just not working. These voters are not coming. And on the other hand, they managed to attract the left-wing voters and really cannibalize, in your terms, the left-wing parties. And this is how the center became, these kind of center parties became big electorally, but very hollow in essence. So no vision, no question. And over time, I think there is also a process, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, of because their cues are going further and further to the right in this effort to find these new audiences that they really wish were there, they also kind of re-educate the formerly left-wing voters and really kind of pushing forward this right-wing anti-Netanyahu kind of politics that sort of took over the center. But I wanted to ask you about something that you said about competition, because you really emphasize how important it is in this story. And I was wondering how it relates to your thinking, because I know a lot of your research also deals with competition in very different ways.
Yeah, thanks for the great summary. You put it in your words. It sounds even more convincing. So,
Oh, it does.
but about competition. Well, competition, and this is not my phrase. It's the phrase of Adam Perzovsky, one of the famous kind of democratic theorists in the world. But I think it captures kind of the essence of competition in democracy quite nicely. He said that competition is the kind of the heartbeat of democracy. Now, during the judicial overhaul and now, we all marched for democracy, right? We all kind of, even the name of the group that we're talking with now is kind of We Democracy, right? And people argued, what does democracy mean? Is it just, majority rule? Is it just checks and balances? Does it include judicial review? Does it include basic human rights? All of those, of course, are important. But at its core, democracy is first and foremost a system of thriving, non-violent political competition. It's about giving citizens genuine alternatives, about letting them choose between different visions. It's about holding governments accountable and allowing change when one side loses in a non-violent way. And in Israel, I think we've lost sight of that and of the centrality of competition to democracy. Now, of course, competition can be hollowed out in several ways, one of which is, just cheating or manipulation. So someone can cheat the elections or do some kind of legal tricks or change the rules of the game that we all know happened in other countries like Hungary or Trump's attempts in 2000 and what was it, 20, whatever. But there is another way to hollow out or undermine democratic competition, which is more subtle, but it's, I think, no less important, which is when one competitor simply adopts the worldview of the other side almost wholesale. And this is exactly what happened in Israel in terms of security and peace. So the center, the new center, has absorbed the right's ideological assumptions on the occupation, on Iran, on Lebanon, on the Abraham Accords, on everything. And we also had a really nice example today. Even we can talk about what happened in Qatar today. And doing all this, the center, while saying our job is just to manage the country more responsibly, more efficiently, without being that so divisive. But in terms of essence, accepting all the assumptions of the Israeli right. Now, without competition, to your point, democracy declines. But beyond just the democratic theory, I'm a political theorist, so I like to talk about it, but to kind of get the discussion more to the ground, think about the politics without competition. So if your platform is basically that, the best you can do is just soften or mitigate what the other side is doing in a more responsible way, or maybe with fewer extremists in your government, or by reducing polarization, or you think that reducing polarization is your main task, then you've already lost the game before it even began. So you've left the field empty. So so many liberals now or centrists in Israel are thinking of themselves or acting like they are the referee, when in fact they are supposed to be one of the players, the competitors. And at the moment, they are not only supposed to be one of the competitors, they are a competitor on the losing side. And this is why, and this is always an example that makes me laugh. Lapid always says in all of his writings, in the Shiloach and in his new book, he always kind of defines the new center or his new politics like so. He says the center's role is to, I wrote it down here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. The central role is to mitigate between contradictions in Israeli society. So when he says that, he completely misses the point of what it is to be a political competitor. If you are the mitigator, you're not a competitor. So if the liberal camp in Israel ever wishes to win, it cannot just manage, it cannot just do politics as the referee between the extremes on both sides. It has to compete and offer a vision of itself. It can be a vision from the center, but it must be a vision. It cannot be a hollow center.
So I think I want to pick up on one of the topics you brought up here, because I think polarization is a big word that everyone is using. And I have my own many objections to the discourse around polarization. I think many times it's misleading more than actually revealing. But I want to ask you about that, because the way I see it, there are two different ways to define what the problem is in Israel right now, and at least two ways to understand what should be the solution. And I think that the polarization debate, apart from very often ignoring Palestinians entirely and even Palestinian citizens of Israel, this sort of stuff, basically the polarization debate says our biggest problem is that people are too far out in their ideological convictions, and it's really hard for them to collaborate. This is our problem, and therefore what we need is to fight the extremes and embrace the center and come together and hug each other, and it will be okay. Something like that, right? I mean, I'm not being too accurate, but sort of that's the idea. Another way to see the problem is that we have a right-wing camp that has radicalized so much and grasped so much power and shifted the entire political conversation, political map further and further to the extremes that were unacceptable even for right-wing parties in Israel not that long ago, and that these forces should be fought and defeated. And these seem to be very different visions and understandings of the very basic questions of what the problem is and what the solutions are. And I want to know how do you think about the role of the center parties inside these kind of argument?
So to be honest, I think this is the most important debate in Israel right now within the liberal camp. And I think for people who are on this conversation, I think to kind of see what's going on within the liberal camp right now as a fierce debate between these two groups that you mentioned, the one group that sees polarization as the main problem in Israel society, and one group that sees the kind of elite capture by the radical right of Israel society. I think that's the most important debate right now within kind of the Israeli liberal camp. And I have, of course, a view on that I will try to convince you all. But let me say something at the start before I kind of dive into my own view. I do think that polarization is dangerous and problematic to any political society, to any kind of liberal society. There are different kinds of polarization. There's like ideological polarization, like you mentioned. There are also effective polarization, which is kind of the most worrisome for most kind of researchers, which is effective polarization is basically how much each camp hates one another, the kind of the feelings of resentment against one another. And societies with high levels of specifically effective polarization, ideological polarization is not always bad, but effective polarization is normally dangerous and leads to bad stuff, echo chambers, extremism, political deadlock. Nobody denies that. But the question is what led to that polarization and what should be done with that polarization, and how can we characterize this polarization? And the way centrists talk about polarization, I believe, this is a fair characterization of their view, rests on a very particular story, and I think that story is wrong or goes wrong many ways. So this is how they tell it, and I think this is a generous reading. So I really try to be as kind of fair as I can to this worldview, because many people hold that view that are part of our camp, that are colleagues, our friends. So I think this is how they tell it. And I would love the kind of audience to say if they think I got something wrong. They say, and I'm sure you all heard this kind of phrase before, 80% of Israelis agree on 80% of the issues. The other 20% are extremists on the right and the left, and they drag us to useless conflicts. And the task then is to empower the silent majority to bring right-wingers and left-wingers, which are kind of liberal, but also not, together, and to realize that we all actually agree on most things, and then to turn that into agreements, consensus documents, coalition papers, and so on and so forth. Now, here's the key
You're
point.
saying the occupation is the problem. Apart from the occupation, we have a consensus among most Israelis about most issues. That's the claim.
So it's a bit more complicated than that. So I'll try to kind of to explain. The key point is that for centrists, the ideal of politics is, I call it, politics is about revealing stuff to people, not winning. So just to explain, if centrists think, the kind of new centrist, if we just show people that they are basically alike, that they share far more in common than they think, if we can, draft a document that demonstrates document of agreements like Gantz calls it all the time, that demonstrates that we already agree on most things, as many, by the way, tried to do in the judicial overhaul debate. They came to the president, to his Yitzhak Herzog's office, and kind of came up with these documents that we can all agree on. Then, only then, if we can show this, we can succeed. So politics on this view is less about competition and more about uncovering the hidden agreements that already exist out there in our kind of polarized society. It is
so
a
there
view.
is no need to convince anyone or persuade anyone of anything, because actually we are all already agreeing on most things.
Exactly. It's a view of politics without conflict. So conflict on this view seems like, an aftermath, something like artificial that extremists create, but not something essential to political life. And I think at least that's an honest and fair representation of the worldview. But there are, I think, at least three big problems with it. And maybe I can kind of go and kind of present them one after the other. I said three, right? Yeah, okay. So the first one is that the real conflict, or the main conflicts in Israeli society, are in the so-called 20% that we disagree on. So of course we can all agree on health. We want to have good healthcare and have a strong army and maybe on economic growth, and even on the fact that Israel should be Jewish and democratic state, whatever that means. But the real questions, the ones that will decide on Israel's future and soul as a country, are precisely the ones we disagree on. So, will Israel be a liberal democracy or a Jewish supremacist Sparta? Will there be genuine equality between Jews and Arabs? Will Israel have recognized borders or remain an occupying power forever? That's not, 20%. That's the heart of the matter. And if your worldview, and this is essential, if your worldview is that we should ignore these questions and focus only on what we can agree on, as Naftali Bennett's last government tried to do, and they tried to do that, you will fail, because politics happens exactly in the 20%. So that's the first part. The second part, or the second reason why this picture goes wrong, is that this is not how politics works. Politics is always been, since the Greeks and whatever, it's about conflict and competition. If one side keeps fighting under any regime, not only under like modern liberal democracies, under any political regime, if one side keeps fighting and the other side says, conflict is bad, let's build bridges, the result will never be balanced. It will always be a victory for the side that keeps fighting. And that's exactly what we've seen. The spectrum has shifted, as you said, steadily to the right, because the right kept fighting and competing, and the center decided not to be a competitor at all. And the third thing, right? Yeah, the third reason is that this centrist picture, I think, misdiagnoses reality about polarization. So polarization in Israel is not, it's a matter of fact. It's not a result of two equal extremes pulling apart. The radical left in Israel has been politically irrelevant for decades. There are many reasons for that. We can criticize the radical left
Zoom. Yeah.
in another Zoom. but they have been politically irrelevant for decades. They have no political power in Israel. The radical right, by contrast, had captured the state, literally captured the state. In the 80s, Kahanism was shunned even by Likud. Today, Kahanists control the government. That's not two extremes, that's one radical movement seizing power. And if this is reality, and this is the point, then the solution cannot be bridge building or finding the middle ground between the Kahanist and staunch right-wingers, which are within the liberal camp like Naftali Bennett, or weakening both extremes. The solution, if this is reality, if you want to get back to the center within kind of the borders of liberal democracy, must be to fight and to win against what is the polarizing factor, which is not the two extremes, but the far right. So what we need to do, if you kind of agree with my worldview, is to redraw the boundaries of legitimacy in Israeli politics, to push, in other words, Jewish supremacy back to the margins where it belongs. And that means competing over Israel's future, not hiding behind unity slogans or politely keep allowing the far right to keep growing stronger.
So I find what you're saying really fascinating because I feel like it really aligns with many things that I found in my research on the Israeli media and how journalists are seeking a way to navigate in this very hostile environment, and trying to find always the middle ground between a right-wing camp that becomes more and more radicalized and goes further and further to the right, and a kind of liberal left-wing camp that becomes smaller and smaller, less and less influential, and with the influence of the center, more and more centric and actually more to the right as well. So I could really see over the years how journalists in Israel, the ones who are trying to do their job properly and actually report on what's happening out there, are kind of swept further and further to the right because of this kind of constant search for the exact middle ground between two very unequal forces. But I want to ask you whether what you're saying really is that perhaps the public has gone further and further to the right, and all Israelis are now much more right-leaning than they used to be a few years ago, and maybe that's the problem, and it's not necessarily about Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid.
So yeah, that's a kind of pushback I often get from many people. They say, what do you want from kind of the centrists or kind of politicians? The problem is not in kind of the elitist politics, it's about the people. In Hebrew, like there's a slogan that politicians always say, Ha'am Yemani, if people here are familiar with it. Actually, when I had a conversation with Bougie Herzog, when was it? Don't remember. 2016, 17, when he was the kind of competing for the leadership of the Labour Party back then, he kind of told me basically that he thinks that he cannot kind of promote a lefty vision for Israel because this is how Israelis are. They are right-wing people.
I even heard it when I was working in parliament many years ago in Meretz, which is supposed to be a more left-wing party. People saying, "Am Yemani." It's not, and it should be said, it's a very convenient narrative for politicians to instead of accounting for their own failures, to blame the voters, basically.
Yeah, and I think this is the kind of very strong narrative within Israeli politics, and I think it should be tackled. And I think there are two main kind of good responses to this kind of story about the rightness, I don't know, of the Israeli politics. So the first point is that, and this point is more directed to politicians that kind of take this line, like you just said. If someone thinks, or if you think that as a politician that the people are right-wing and that's the end of the story, then you're in just a wrong line of work, or it's the wrong kind of business. Because your job as a politician is not just to, get elected. It is to represent a worldview and to implement it. And if you think that, the public leans right, then your responsibility is to fight to change it. And if it cannot be changed, if there is some kind of, I don't know how to even describe it, but if there is some kind of metaphysical magic that fixes Israeli public opinion forever as a right-wing public, then we do not really live in a democracy, because there cannot be changes of government. But if it can be changed, and of course it can be changed, then saying that people are right-wing is just an excuse, as you say, a way of giving up. And it's just not true. Israelis change their minds all the time. So if you cannot do the job of persuasion, then just step aside, but do not claim that being in the minority right now is just a reason to abandon the work of politics, which is to take people from the other side to your side. Well, the second point, which is I think more fundamental, is that sorry, is that the claim that the people are right-wing reflects how should I put it, a very mistaken view of what politics is. Again, I think my debate with the center is mostly about their vision what politics is, and it comes down to this again, about this question about the Ha'am Yemani. Because their view, I think, of politics is a caricature borrowed from kind of marketplace or economics. So in this caricature, voters are like, consumers with fixed preferences, and politicians are like shopkeepers trying to, appeal to the broadest denominator in order to maximize sales. And this mindset has gone, I think, hand in hand also with the domination or the rise of marketers and salespersons in centrist politics, which are now kind of the political advisors of most centrist kind of leaders. But this kind of big picture is wrong on many counts, but at least 2 counts. So the first count is that 100 years of data in economics and political science shows that preferences are not fixed. Leaders and also salespersons with advertisements, it's not even right about the market. They change minds, and people respond to leadership, to arguments, to vision. So if you think politics is simply about, guessing what people already think, you will always lose to the side that is actually shaping what people think. And that is exactly what happened to the Israeli right, that has been doing this kind of work for decades, while the left and the center try to kind of, guess what the public thinks, and was hesitant for all the time. And the second count is that this market view is also, if you think about it, profoundly anti-leadership, because it imagines politicians as followers of consensus and not shapers of it. But real leadership means taking people to better places, of course, but not just echoing back what they already believe. Now, of course, I'm not naive. There are always constraints in reality. So you cannot just, ignore public opinion. You cannot pursue anything you want. I worked a lot in campaigns. I know how it goes. I know how the machine works. But the question you must ask as a politician, as a leader, is not how do I fit into the consensus, but how do I change it? So an example I always like to give is, think about it as about the case when politicians kind of uses focus groups in campaigns to kind of know what people think. One way to use the results of a focus group is to say, this is what people think, I should just repeat that in order to get as much votes as I can. Another way to go is to say, this is how people think, this is the challenge, now I need to see how do I move them closer to my values and my views. Good politics is the second way, and this is what the right wing has been doing. It's not only good politics in terms of values, it's also good politics electorally. It wins elections. So yes, to kind of, I blab too much, but Israel is may lean right at this moment. But the real question is, do we treat this as a destiny or we treat this as a challenge?
So you're saying kind of all the data that we are constantly bombarded with, all these research and polls about public opinion, they should be the starting point for a politician and not an end point. It shouldn't be limiting their political imagination, but be the starting point from where they can think, okay, how do I take people from where they are now to where I want them to be? And here I think the question is, and there are a few questions from the audience as well, so I'll just ask you one last question and then I'll turn to questions from the audience. Let's say people here who are very kind of generous with their time and listening to us blurbing for a while, let's say they agree with everything you said, and they realize that this shift within the liberal camp in Israel from left to this hollow center is really detrimental and problematic for many reasons. What's the solution then? Should we go to the left? What is the outcome of your analysis of this very influential force in Israeli politics in the last few decades?
So I'll try to be brief because I see we already kind of spoken quite a lot, but I don't want to dodge this question. So if someone wants to push back again in the Q&A, please do. But I do want to answer not by kind of proposing a kind of magic formula how the left can win, because nobody has this formula. But I want to answer it by saying what would be the wrong approach or the wrong take to take home from what I'm saying right now. So often when I'm giving this talk, people kind of come to me after and say, okay, so what we should do now is kind of speak truth to power and say that Israel is kind of wrong and bad society and that the people in Israel are corrupt and this is a kind of apartheid state, yada, yada, and to kind of preach to the people the truth all the time. And this is how kind of people will be convinced. But this is not the way to go also. And this is oftentimes how kind of lefties translate the criticism against the center by thinking that speaking truth to power is enough to kind of change things in politics. And this is not how you create political competition. To create political competition in a society, you cannot take yourself outside of the society, act as a moral preacher, and see your role in politics, your main role in politics, as condemning the public that you are part of. Because if you're always condemning the public that you're part of without offering a vision, then why should anyone listen to you? Why should people be convinced? The only way in order to kind of shift the power in Israel for the long term, for the short term, it's complicated and there are like many factors in play. But in the long term, if you think about Israeli politics in 20 years from now, it's by doing two things. Thinking about, as a politician, as an activist, as a citizen, how do I contribute to setting the agenda under my own terms? And this means offering a vision on the main question that Israeli politics is surrounded about. And no matter how much centrist leaders will want to kind of run from these questions, but it's about security and peace and the kind of liberal identity, yes or no, of this place. So one is vision and kind of setting the agenda, and the other is building power. Building power, and this is by mobilizing people, and we can talk about it a lot for another conversation. But so to answer your question in a very kind of crooked way, what I want to end our conversation with is by saying, if you don't want to be a centrist, it doesn't mean that you need to kind of be a moral preacher. This is not the conclusion that I want people to have. That's it.
But you're saying there is another path there that is not the kind of expressive symbolic politics of the left, and it's not the hollow center. Interesting. So we have great questions in the chat. So let's start with David Solomon, who asked, it's a great question. Why did the new center refrain from publicly formulating a vision as the old center did? Was it afraid to do so for electoral reasons? And I think if I may say something about that before I hand over to you, Shai, I think because it's a great question. Why are they doing that? Because it's both not loyal to their own values and ideologies, and it's not strategically working. So why is that happening? I think this is really important to highlight the very successful public campaign delegitimizing the left in Israel. It started decades ago. We've seen it in other countries, and it got to the point where very few people are willing to take this label willfully, from being the kind of biggest party that ruled Israel for decades. Being affiliated with the left became sort of a curse word. And I think this is a big part of this. And I think, to add to Shai's analysis, I think part of the problem with these new centrist parties is that they actually collaborated with, facilitated, and even promoted themselves the delegitimization of the left in Israel and of Palestinian citizens of Israel and other groups that are supposed to be their supporters. But that's a whole different story. So definitely, I think the fact that being attacked and targeted by the right was a driving force. I guess it was more difficult to intimidate Arik Sharon, but also I think back at the time, the whole kind of power structure was so different that it's really hard to compare. That would be my response. Also, the media kind of environment changed significantly, and it is very asymmetrical at the moment and really favors anyone who leans to the right and really shuts down everyone on the left. And we've seen this again and again in our research. But what are you saying about this question by David Solomon, Shai?
My answer will be quite similar to yours. One is the delegitimization campaign, which I think in Israel, if you take a comparative perspective, it's one of the most successful delegitimization campaigns in kind of Western countries in recent history. It is quite equivalent nowadays to call someone a lefty as a curse word or as a traitor. And it's been like that since 2010. Which some of the kind of leaders of the liberal camp now were the leaders of these kind of delegitimization campaigns, like Avigdor Lieberman and Naftali Bennett. So that's one kind of part of it, because the left became delegitimized, and the fact it was so successful, by the way, it's because there was no political competition to kind of counter it. It's part of the picture. But the other thing is just kind of, it's a banal answer, but it's kind of short-term electoral success. They just confuse again and again short-term electoral success with political power. And I always say that to politicians, the fact that you got 24 seats or 20 seats doesn't matter much, or doesn't determine, at least. It might help you to get more political power, but it's not a kind of sufficient condition for you to get real political power. And what these kind of, by not offering a vision like Naftali Bennett is doing now, like Gantz did before, with his silence, like campaigns in the center became being silent. That's the campaign, like Eisenkot is doing now. They all think that short term, it will kind of lead more voters within the liberal camp to vote for them, which is true. This is how they cannibalize on other parties. But again, it doesn't kind of, I think they confuse this kind of gaining more seats with kind of gaining power, which I think is completely different story. So that would be my answer. I'll try to work, because I know there are kind of...
Maybe we need to think about how to set goals that are not just how many votes you get, but how do you actually measure political power. And I think we can learn a lot on this topic from the far right in Israel that used to be very, very marginal and has done incredible work in maximizing and making sure they are overrepresented in all centers of decision making. So we have another question, two questions from Michelle Grant, who asks, if security is priority number one for a majority of Israelis, what does the center need to say to get their vote? Great question. And the second question, to what extent is the economy important electorally?
Again, great question. So thank you all. I'll try again to be quick. About what the center needs to say, there's like, there can be open discussion and frank discussion about what should be the right policy or the right vision for security that also matches liberal values that the center can promote or that the left can promote. There are people within the left camp that kind of disagree with me. I'm a kind of two-stater, staunch two-stater. I can talk about it in a different talk if you want. And people have like a one-state solution. These arguments are less, I think, of a secondary importance for the debate. The center needs to offer something. It doesn't like matter. It does matter, of course, what will be the details, but the starting point is to offer something. And what they're offering now is the same managing the conflict that the right has offered up until October 7th, and this is what led us to October 7th, and after October 7th. And this is what Naftali Bennett is selling right now. This is what Benny Gantz is selling right now. This is what Yair Lapid, he changed his mind in the beginning of the war. Now he saw some poll that says that he's too leftist, so he's now back again trying to kind of eliminate Uda from the Knesset. You can see these people are changing their minds because of polls, and they don't offer anything. So the main point is that they need to offer something if they want to even be considered as political contenders. And about economy in Israeli politics, I think it has a lot of impact on, the structure of Israeli society, on Israeli culture, on Israeli power relations. And there are some mapping between kind of voting patterns of lower socioeconomic groups and higher socioeconomic groups, etc. But as an issue, as a dividing issue, and this is a fight or an argument I have with many dear friends in my own camp, I think it has zero impact on kind of electoral results or about kind of the main division in Israeli political life or about the soul of this country. And this makes Israel, I think, a unique case that is very different from kind of other countries. But of course, I need to be more careful. It's not zero, but I want to be kind of as kind of harsh as I can because I don't want people to go that way and think that if we'll talk about social democracy, people will vote for us because it will never be the case.
Right. So, and I think whoever kind of knows the numbers and data that we have, the economy rarely dominates the public conversation and rarely kind of dictates what people in Israel are voting for. I would argue there are many other countries that are going in that direction. The more kind of culture wars and all kind of other issues become the main dividing issues. People are not necessarily voting on the economy, which perhaps we would like them to, but that's just not the case. In Israel, it was really, it hasn't been the case for decades. So thanks so much. There are more great questions in the chat, but I see it's already past 9.
I think we have
can take
15 more minutes.
Okay, brilliant. So we have another question from Michael Lesser, and it's more of a comment, I would say, but he says that in a pluralistic democracy, the job of the political parties is to differentiate from each other. Perhaps in a mature democracy, the parties just present themselves as more efficient in managing society when they agree in the essentials of their societies. In Israel and the US, the influence of the Kahanists and MAGA is to pull their host parties, Republicans in the US, to the right. Is the MAGA/Kahanist model an aberration and we turn to the consensus model someday in the future, or a more mobilized extreme as we have now in the US and /Israel and other European countries seem to be following the same path?
I don't want to predict the future, so I don't know, but I do think it's a great comment, and I think it kind of tells a lot about the nature of competition in liberal democracy and how it changed in recent years. So up until recently, until the kind of the surge of anti-liberal politics that we're all experiencing in recent years, the main political competition at least up to the 90s, when then we started having this kind of ideological convergence on economic issues in many countries. But the main there was always fierce political competition. So when you say in mature political democracies, they agree on the kind of basic rules, this is true, but there is still fierce political competition between, Thatcher and Labour in the UK. They both agreed that it should be a liberal democracy, whatever you think about Thatcherism or about kind of
Tony Blair nowadays, yeah.
or democratic socialism. But there was fierce competition within the boundaries of an agreed kind of baseline rules of what it means to be a liberal democracy. And that's what it means to be a mature, healthy liberal democracy. What we see now, it's in recent years, is that the nature of political competition changed. Now political competition is not within the boundaries of liberal democracy, it is on liberal democracy itself. And when this happens, many things happen, but you need to change your orientation as a political actor, because now you're fighting for the kind of soul or the mere nature of the regime you're in. So you cannot have this kind of maybe liberal assumptions about neutrality and pluralization, that you want to kind of let people compete and it doesn't really matter who wins. The most important thing is that there will be kind of non-violent change of regimes, and that's it. If the other party wins, it can lead to kind of semi-autocratic regime. So the stakes are higher, and it makes the society way less stable, and it changes the nature of democracy. And this is something that if democracies don't want to go in this kind of democratic backsliding route, they should try to prevent as much as possible. So that's just about the nature of the competition that changed. About what will happen in the future, I don't know. I highly recommend reading the research of Professor Noam Gidron, who always say that one main indicator of many countries that you can see that will kind of fall into this kind of anti-liberal surge is how the mainstream liberal right parties act. If they collaborate with the right wing, with the hard right, the MAGA in your question, or the Kahanist, then they will evaporate and they will be swallowed by the populist right. But if they hold still, there are a few cases where you can see that this was the thing that prevented the whole country from collapsing into this kind of populist surge. So that's kind of a short answer to a great and complicated question.
And I would also try to take this very kind of doom and gloom situation to suggest a silver lining, that when we look at the way that MAGA took over the Republican Party, or the way that the Kahanist movement managed to transform the Israeli right, we also see how groups within a camp can really change the face of their political allies and how they do politics, and hopefully we can do so in the future as well. We'll take one last question from Gal Cronenberg, who raised her hand, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Shai and Ayala. So I have two questions that are kind of related to each other. The first is a short one. You started to talk about the Israeli Center only from Kadima, but there was Israeli Center before. And my, I would say, quick question is, maybe Kadima is the different example. I mean, I don't know, how do you see Shinui and other central parties in the past of Israel, like in the history of Israel? And the second one, which kind of relates to this and also relates to what Michelle, I think, asked before, is, I mean, we discussed the Israeli Center, but we didn't really discuss what does it mean to be center. I mean, what is the definition of a center? And maybe it's part of the complication, because like when we talk about right and left, there is a framework and agenda which is quite clear and defined where is the limits, and it sounds to me that center is just saying I'm not here and I'm not there, but it, like, by definition, center means saying what I am not and not what I am, yes. So maybe it's kind of the reality that this is how the center behaves, because there is not a pure definition of what does it mean being a center, rather than what it doesn't mean being a center. And then maybe the responsibility is not on the center, but on the right and the left to define the discussion limits. And the center basically is saying nothing. I don't know, does it really need to have an agenda, or can it always have an agenda? Is it possible to ask from the center to actually have an agenda when it's undefined, kind of?
Yeah,
That's the question.
both great questions. About the historical part, I start with Kadima because that's the first time the center was the dominant force as a kind of governing or potentially governing party of Israeli politics, and that was the same was with the case of Kahol Lavan and Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. Before that, the center was not a force in Israeli politics that was considered something that can govern or be kind of a potentially the biggest party in the Knesset. There is a very long history of Israeli centrist parties, even in the Israeli kind of Congress in the kind of late 19th century. And the nature of this center also changed historically, but I see it as like a politically marginal phenomena. And I think it's more interesting, or it's not more interesting, but for my reasons, this is why I kind of focus only on the kind of past 2 decades, because it has become the most dominant force in the opposition. That's purely for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
About the second question, I don't, as a kind of political analytical philosopher, I don't think that definitions are I don't think that by definition you can kind of determine what you can or cannot expect from a kind of real political party. It is true that because contingently or historically we use spatial concepts like right and left to kind of talk about politics, then if you want to kind of offer a third way, I'm using another kind of political metaphor here of Tony Blair, then you need to kind of also use a spatial concept, and then you use a center. So you can see why maybe centrists be prone to define themselves according to the right and the left and not have a view of their own. I can see why some will be inclined to do so, and this is why we see a hollow center. But there can be also a hollow left or a hollow right for in kind of certain kind of times in history. And there can be a non-hollow serious center where there is, in reality, three ways or three visions that can compete with one another. So I see why kind of the definitional thing will make us think that the center is kind of by definition must be hollow, but I don't think Kadima is the exception, and I do think that there can be centrist parties. If you want to talk about it from a sociological point of view, I do think that the kind of label of centrist kind of brings in people who likes to think about themselves as moderate and kind of more mature and whatever, but this is kind of a low-level sociological analysis that I don't want to commit to. So that's for a different talk.
Okay, so you're saying it doesn't have to be basically a relative term, although it has this tendency to become a relative term that kind of defines itself based on the opposition. I would like to thank everyone for sticking with us for so long. Much appreciated. Please join our WhatsApp group of Molad if you wish to hear more from us, and we will think about more open conversations perhaps we can have with We Democracy. Thanks so much, We Democracy, for having us.
Yeah, so I wanted to thank Shai and Ayala. Thank you very much for coming and talking with us. I also posted again the links to join the WhatsApp group, the newsletter, and to support. And we will also send by email to everyone registered the links and the recording of this conversation. And next time, we really hope to have you, Ayala, talking a little bit about the Israeli media. Yes, so thank you very much, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Keep up the good work. You're doing important things. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.